Thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I never actually lived in the U.S. until I went to work for Dine, and it was interesting because, U.S. citizens, of course, are taxed on their global income even if they don't live there. And so I always had to file income taxes in the United States even though I didn't live there. And one year, there was a contentious election going on, and I thought, if I'm going to do this, I probably should vote. So I tried to register to vote in the U.S. It turns out that if you've only ever lived in a hospital in the U.S., you can't register to vote there. It's a funny little wrinkle to their arrangements. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but I thought that might amuse you all. So thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm going to have a problem here. I broke my glasses, and so either I can see you or I can see this. Those are really the options, so I'm going to see this. I sometimes wonder whether we're at the period of peak irony. Every day I read various things. I read news reports, I read opinion pieces. They warn about the dangers of the internet. It's a tool of terrorism. It erodes family life. It has been catastrophic for newspapers. It might take over your car. It might make your ice cream all melty. Thieves, whether of copyrighted material or personal information, lurk behind every service. All people do all day long is stream video, some of it purloined, much of it pornographic. They're locked away in their own personal bubble of entertainment, and they're disengaged from the wider society. And the society, anyway, is in imminent danger of collapse due to foreign interference in our socio-political order. How do the attackers interfere? Through the internet, of course. And how do I receive all this news? Why, that too, through the internet. Now, our culture is by no means the first to spend time criticizing a technology through that technology. You heard I studied philosophy, so Plato's Socrates. He, for instance, spent some time in the Phaedrus attacking the utility of writing. Yet we might never have known of his argument if he hadn't written it down. Nevertheless, it seems to me these days, we spend a lot of time online talking about the online experience. And the content of the discussion seems to be, somebody should do something. Now, of course, somebody should do something. The internet is one of those transformative technologies that comes along from time to time and makes everything different. These technologies demand something from us, the people who have to deal with them. And let us be honest, the internet has become a conduit for terrible things. Hatred, theft, political interference, murder, these are all now experiences of the internet, the whole litany of things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, so who is somebody? I've learned that whenever somebody should do something and nobody shows up, nothing gets done. And also, of course, if you leave the doing to somebody else, you get to live with whatever they did. So somebody should do something. Who is somebody? And what should they do? Well, Peter D. Norton has outlined an important change that happened in North America between the 1920s and the 1930s. At the beginning of the 1920s, people crossed the street wherever they wanted. Children played in the streets. This was totally normal. Certainly by the end of the 1930s, people had learned to cross at marked crossings. The difference, of course, was the rise of the automobile and the danger that it presented to unprotected human bodies. To deal with this ubiquitous new technology, the technology had to develop, but humans had to learn new habits as well. Yet that is not the only lesson we have from the rise of the automobile. In 1957, you could buy a Cadillac with air conditioning, with power seats, automatic headlamp dimmers, power windows, automatic transmission, power brakes and steering, a remote trunk release, and a power convertible top. But you could not buy it with seat belts. That you had to have added special. Ralph Nader's call in Unsafe at Any Speed was to forge new instruments of citizen action. We got them through regulations that certainly changed the automotive landscape forever. But the barriers to the entry to the car business went up as well, and General Motors spent most of the second half of the 20th century fighting against various government regulators. They made about half the automobiles in the world in the 1950s, and they went into bankruptcy in 2008. Big changes to business environments can make big changes in a market. Many people look at the internet today and the applications that it brings and that so many of us depend on, and they feel that the internet needs to be regulated. Some of the largest internet companies are saying that too. But I see in these twin glimpses of automotive history 2 lessons that should make us ask exactly what we ought to do. The first lesson is a reminder from John Culkin, or maybe Winston Churchill. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Anyone alive in the last few decades lived in the automotive age, even if they didn't have a car, because the automobile so transformed life that everyone depends on it, at least indirectly. Similarly, we are all now squarely in the early parts of a networked society. Even people who do not use the internet today are having their lives changed by the internet. Because we live in this world, the technology is going to change certain facts of life. It will take time to change and shape the technology and bend it in the direction we want. And it will also take time for humans to develop a new sense of what is threatening. With the car, we needed to learn how to jaywalk. We needed to learn that there were new rules about how to cross the street in order to increase safety. Note that this did not make the streets completely safe. I live in Toronto, pedestrian deaths are on the rise there. Now, in much the same way, we're going to have to learn how to be safe with the technology that is today still often too confusing to be used safely. But the second lesson is that we need to be extremely careful in what we regulate and how. We in Canada live in a highly regulated society now, and we expect those high degrees of regulation to keep us safe. But the transformative technologies of the 20th century were introduced with little regulation. They only gradually came to be regulated. Many of the regulations were initially voluntary and were effectively insurance protection schemes. The electrical and building codes, for instance, were mostly the result of pressure from insurance companies who didn't want to insure properties unless certain standards were met. Regulation implies a certain maturity of the regulated market, and the regulations of new technologies usually mature along with that market. Now, the contemporary commercial internet did not exist at all until the middle of the 1990s. Facebook is not 20 years old. Instagram isn't even 10. Most of the so-called Internet of Things hasn't even been invented yet. We have barely begun to understand the potential benefits the internet can bring us. Yet these technologies are already transforming our lives, and not only for the worse. For every horror story we hear about hate speech or fake news or terrorism online, we can also find stories of someone building an income for themselves, or of isolated communities who are finally able to graduate kids from high school without sending them thousands of kilometers away, or of Indigenous youth who find the support they need not to kill themselves. The very things that make these technologies frightening, their speed, their ubiquity, and the way they make communication easy, are also the very things that provide the benefit. There is an awful lot of baby in the bathwater. We better look hard before we throw it all out. So in this complicated policy environment, I think Canada has been showing the way forward. For instance, the Internet Society and the Canada chapter together, and together with the Government of Canada, specifically ISED, and stakeholders such as CIRA, TIPIC, and Canary, interested corporate and individual parties of all kinds, we all got together over the last year to work on a multi-stakeholder process to enhance Internet of Things security. The process launched efforts in consumer awareness, in network resilience, and in labeling of devices that can help consumers keep themselves safe as they adopt the technology. That alone would seem worthwhile. But part of the victory came from the way this happened. We invited all stakeholders, because that's part of the way the internet works. We do not prefer multi-stakeholder mechanisms as some political program. The internet is made up of many independent networks. If you want those networks to implement common security practices, you have to convince them to do it. The best way to do that, the best way to convince people to come along, is to use an open multi-stakeholder process that allows every view to be heard. Too many governments today are rushing to regulate on the internet by consulting the supposedly important players, usually in private. Canada's approach so far has largely been to use the strengths of the internet to figure out what to do. We proceed through networks of people and their shared interests to try to improve the shared fate of all who are dependent on the internet. The Internet of Things security work, for instance, is not done, and it won't be for some time. This is a new area, and it's developing quickly. But that's all the more reason to depend on a wide population of interested parties to help ensure it develops in a way that is good for us all. At the same time, Canada stands out for its challenging access environment. With vast distances and a sparse population, it is not too surprising that access is uneven. But there are tremendous opportunities here for new connectivity models to respond to these challenges. The Internet Society is engaged with the government of the Northwest Territories, the Northern Lights General Partnership, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, and others to support communities in the Northwest Territories who are creating and managing community networks. We are undertaking other research on access issues along with Jangla, MLab, and the University of Alberta. We are working with partners to ensure that Nunavut-made data and content is under local control and that it is at least as accessible locally as it is accessible elsewhere. Reliable, speedy, affordable access is a serious problem around the world. Canada is in an ideal position to show the world some good solutions. And of course, Canada itself stands to gain from more reliable, widely available, affordable access to the internet. Since the internet is made up of many different networks, it offers inherent advantages to people who want to innovate. You don't need anything special, and you don't need any special permission. This is part of what has made the internet such a source of growth. Yet when access is uneven, the potential is unevenly realized. Remote and rural communities deserve that access if they want it. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities deserve that access too if they want it. This engine for economic growth, for social support, and for community building is something that can help us all and can help Canada realize its full potential as a country. So, the policy response we need is one that depends on involving not just all Canadians, but also the ways of the internet itself in developing that policy. This means certainly embracing the potential of the technology. That's not hard to defend. In a country with large agricultural sector, for instance, the potential for the Internet of Things to make for more efficient farming with better water use, more accurate yield predictions, and more precise and less dangerous application of fertilizers and pesticides, that should excite us all. In a country of vast distances, the potential for the Internet to help us with healthcare, with transportation effectiveness, and even just keeping people in touch with one another should inspire us to build those capabilities quickly and embrace them. And in a country experiencing faster than many the effects of climate change, the use of a cheap but reliable technology to help us face and manage that challenge is an obvious strategy. But it also requires us to find new ways of developing policies and regulations to ensure that we maintain the benefits of the internet. It will not benefit us all to attempt to regulate the internet like a traditional utility because it isn't one. It will not benefit us all to attempt to govern the internet by cooperating with only 5 or 10 of the world's richest companies. It will not benefit us all to mandate new pieces of infrastructure effectively controlled by those same few companies and require that by everyone who wants to launch a new internet service. And it will certainly not benefit us all to retreat to national or regional networks, tidy and controlled, but entirely unlike the instrument of human creativity, potential, and good that the internet can be. So our response must first be to develop the policy in the open, as Canada has mostly been doing. But also, we must resist the impulse to make any response just because some response is needed. Where regulation is necessary, we must ensure that it does not accidentally damage other parts of the internet or permanently entrench the current giants. And we must remember that not everything about the current business environment is just about the internet. Some of the issues we see have to do with corporate behavior generally, not the business those corporations happen to be in. None of this is to suggest that there are no issues to face. The internet has enabled human behavior that is often lamentable and sometimes shocking or even criminal. Stealing people's credit cards or attacking elections or showing a live video of a racist massacre is not okay. And it is an urgent problem for humanity to figure out how to deal with these execrable uses of the technology. But the solution is not to recreate a model in which only the largest and richest firms can operate on the internet, where everyone else has to take what they are willing to sell us. The solution is also not a regulatory regime in which certain voices are invited into the room where decisions are made and everyone else has to accept the outcome. This infrastructure connects us all. We will all need to have a hand in making sure its development continues to empower us. And that is the real measure of the right outcome. The internet is one of the most human technologies ever invented. We at the Internet Society say that the internet is for everyone, and that is because it permits humans to communicate, to come together, to make our shared fate better. The way to do that is to ensure the fundamental strength of the internet's design, its distributed nature, its lack of requirement for centralized infrastructure, continues. We can only do it in collaboration with one another. Canada is a huge country, but it's on a small planet. It's not alone. As it often does, Canada can show the world a middle way forward. This time, we can show how to develop good directions for the internet through broad, multi-stakeholder approaches that keep our shared fate a happy one. Somebody should indeed do something. That somebody is all of us. Thank you very much.